Hello and welcome to StuffTV. I'm your host, Nick Huzar, and I started this channel because I was curious how my very existence impacts the planet, and I found it really hard to find answers. So I decided to do something about it and talk to amazing thought leaders to help enlighten us. And today I'm excited to have Lindsey Hoell, the CEO of Dispatch Goods, here with us. With that, Lindsey, why don't you introduce your company?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Nick. This is really exciting to have this conversation. Um, so I run a company called Dispatch Goods. This stemmed from a problem I found when I was living and working in Hawaii, where the problem of waste was really evident on the beaches. I'm a surfer, so in the oceans, and I got involved and helped businesses transition to more sustainable practices. But when it came to waste, I realized that it was really difficult for businesses to solve this problem internally. And so I decided to go back to business school at Berkeley and try to tackle this. And so the idea behind Dispatch Goods is that there's basically a missing reverse supply chain that is needed in order to reuse things, kind of like recycling, but more localized. And so Dispatch Goods works with companies to allow them to get packaging back and reuse it. And so we're building out that kind of missing infrastructure and reverse supply chain that's needed for circularity.
So an example would be like, who are your customers? Like, who uses it?
Yeah, so Imperfect Foods, for example, is one of our customers. So when you get your shipment from Imperfect Foods, there's freezer packs, for example, that come to your house. And most consumers recognize those freezer packs as something that's reusable. But before we worked with Imperfect, there was no way to send them back. And
Hmm.
so we work with the companies to help them piece together kind of the reverse logistics of how to get those packs. We help with the processing to make sure that they're clean and processed and ready for reuse. And then we get them back to the businesses. So it's kind of like after things go out, how do you get them back processed and back into the supply chain?
Yep. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And if you think about, and you probably already know this, but the amount of packaging, like I think if you look at all the plastic production in the world, I think packaging is like the largest contributor by far. Um,
Yeah, the amount of packaging that we're creating is really startling and devastating, especially because on average, packaging is used for 9 minutes and never used again.
mhm.
So the amount of resources that go into creating something that's used for such a short amount of time is just, it's not sustainable, like in the very fundamental sense of what sustainability is.
Yeah, and if you think of the food delivery as well, like you said, I was using a few of those services, and I think the main reason we stopped was for exactly this issue, where it was me and my wife had a conversation. We're like, look, I like the convenience of this, but the amount of packaging, like I was filling up my fridge with all the ice packs.
Yes, that's exactly right. And we started off working with restaurants, but we always have felt like kind of packaging agnostic in that we want to reuse the packaging that helps build the infrastructure so that we can add more packaging over time. And so while we were working with restaurants in reusable food containers, we were constantly having conversations with end consumers and we're like, what packaging are you hoarding because you feel bad throwing it away, and what's accumulating?
Yeah.
And those freezer packs are something that came up time and time again, and we're like, we should try to solve this.
Yeah, we have a bin in our laundry room full of styrofoam because there's a few
Right.
services that'll do it like once or twice a year. But every
Yep.
time I walk in there, I'm like, it's just getting bigger and bigger.
Right. So yeah. So what do you do with that styrofoam? You just
There's a
hoard it.
service. There's a few different services. They'll come by. They only come by a few times a year.
I gotcha.
Like our local like recycling will also do batteries a few times a year.
Yeah.
So between now and then, though, you just kind of have to let it. You have
Hold
to
on
hoard
to
it.
it. When in the styrofoam, we again, like, we're always having conversations to figure out styrofoam is something that comes up, and people that are part of wine clubs get a lot of styrofoam coolers. And we talked to a guy, he's like, I've got 40 wine coolers in my garage that I feel bad throwing away. Will you guys take them? And so when we think about, you know, basically new products that we want to add, those styrofoam coolers are perfectly capable of being used as 2, 3, 4, 10 more times. It's just that no one is solving the logistics of how to do that. So
Yeah, and I assume with your business, it's very local. So do you when you launched, maybe I would be curious, kind of how the explaining kind of how the process works, and then also, how do you think about like what markets are you available in today?
Yeah. So we launched in San Francisco because that was our backyard. And mostly catering to Northern California. Now we've expanded to offer our service to LA, but we don't do small customers. We're transporting thousands of items generally if we're going to go further, and we batch all of the customers on the same day so that we're running full truckloads, which is
Hmm.
really important, obviously, from a sustainability perspective. And then we launched earlier this year out of Baltimore. That services the East Coast from DC up to New York right now. So we are on both coasts, and how the service works is generally we work with brands that are sending out packaging. Their customers tap into our basically once we partner with companies, their customers can tap into our network and send back packaging. Sometimes you put the packaging out on the same day as the delivery. If there's a customer segment that uses like FedEx or whatever, there's just a dispatch day. And on the dispatch day, just like recycling, you put out your things and they're recollected, aggregated, and then they make it to our facilities in bulk. So we're collecting and processing thousands of items for reuse.
So in each location, you have to have some warehouse to facilitate.
Exactly. So some kind of like there's a warehouse processing center in Baltimore and San Francisco. And then in the other areas, there's generally like some kind of storage facility where things are aggregated. And then we're running trucks too in order to run full truckloads.
I'm curious what the biggest challenge of your business is. I mean, it seems pretty logistic heavy.
Yeah, totally. It is. It's funny because my background was in cardiac surgery. So who thought that I would know how to drive a forklift?
That's the same. Yeah,
yeah, totally. But my co-founder and I both are forklift operators now. So we have gone down a completely different pathway.
I saw that on your website. I think it was maybe your co-founder was navigating. Yeah.
Totally. It's funny because when we got forklift, like our initial forklift training, we had more women than men on the team getting the forklift certificates, and it's a very unusual situation. We felt pretty proud of the fact that 80% of our forklift operators were women.
They're not easy. I used to drive a forklift. I used to
You
work for
did?
a carpet company. They're not easy to drive. They drive kind of weird. No.
I mean, candidly, I suck at it. Maya's good.
Yeah.
She is a forklift pro. I'm just like, I learned, I can do it in a pinch. I do not like to do it. But she, I think, has risen to the challenge. She's also a very good truck driver. The very first day we got a big box truck, I got stuck at the gas station and I had to call her to help me get out of there because I didn't realize that you had to take like wide turns. I'd only driven cars before, and then we got a box truck, and that's not the case. And I got stuck like this close to hitting a pole, and I was like, oh no.
So in the early days of OfferUp, we were trying to figure out how to get scale, and kind of like you were talking about logistics and local markets. So I rented this long haul moving van because I had this kind of growth hacking idea that, local commerce is local. So like, what if we could mass just blanket a neighborhood? Maybe that would be the spark that gets everyone to start buying and selling. And so
Right.
I remember, because my birthday is January 11th, this was January 10th. It was freezing cold outside, and we filled up the back of the truck with 1,000 helium balloons. And I'm like, of course this is going to go work. And so the idea is we found this really dense neighborhood in Seattle here, and we're like, we're going to go door to door and hand all these out. So we found a bunch of people, I think on Craigslist, and just like random people showed up, and I drove this truck really slow, like through this neighborhood, and it looked awesome. Imagine coming home and just as far as you could see was OfferUp branding. The problem, of course, was I rented the truck, and we took a break in the middle of the day. And the guy that rented me this truck, he said, make sure if you ever use the brake, you pull and you turn on the handle. You got to pull and turn for the parking brake to work. Well, I pulled, but I forgot to turn it. So what happened, the back of the truck was open and it started rolling backwards. So I hop out and I hop back in immediately, smash the brake, and I end up launching a woman out of the back of the truck. She sprained her ankle, had to take her to the hospital. And this is a time we had no money. This is the only time I thought we were done, because I had no traction. This is a failed marketing experiment that didn't work. Luckily, we were persistent, and it worked out. But like, I thought that was the day. I'm like, I almost killed someone today.
Oh my God. I am, yes, the logistics, like that's the thing about touching physical things, and it sounds like you have that
I'm not a good
experience.
truck driver. That's what I learned.
Yeah. The very first day that we were doing a delivery in New York, there was an ice storm. And so it was to a really big customer, and our driver was pretty green because we shopped in the bargain bucket for drivers. We learned that lesson. We actually now get tenured drivers. It is worth it. So we didn't want him driving in the ice storm. So Maya and I drove like overnight and realized that finding parking in Manhattan for a box truck is impossible. And we didn't want to leave what we were bringing in the truck because we'd forgotten a lock, and we didn't get in until 3 a.m. And so she and I ended up almost sleeping in the truck in an ice storm.
These are the early entrepreneur stories. This is all the
Yeah.
glory when people say, I want to go start a company. This is all the fun stuff you get to do.
Totally.
Wow.
Yes. Anyways, that's funny. Yeah, it sounds like we've been through those ups and downs.
Wow. So when you so all the items come back to a warehouse, and then
Mhm.
do you then end up, cleaning and bringing them back? Like, what's the other side of that look like?
That's exactly right. So then they're processed. You can kind of think of us as like a tech-enabled dishwashing laundromat. There's basically three process lines depending on what the material type that we're processing for reuse is. Then things are aggregated. They're basically tagged per customer. One thing that we've really learned is that visibility into the supply chain is super important to our customers, because when we started, we were making up a small portion of their packaging, but the program's been really successful with their end customers. So now we're a meaningful portion of their supply chain. So like things are getting tagged along the way, and then we deliver back to our customers. So when we launch with a partner, basically the agreement we have is whatever we get back from their customers that is able to be reused, that they will basically take back, and that's what's set up. And so we do some, obviously, like validation testing of our processes. We do monthly audits. We have an external lab that we work with to test for allergens and
Hmm.
bacterial counts and all of the things, so that our benchmark is that we are actually cleaner than when things arrive new, so that our customers can really trust the product. And then it's delivered, and we try to mimic exactly how it would arrive if it was new. So if they're getting pallets of 600, we create pallets of 600, so that it again like can really integrate seamlessly into how they're ordering packaging.
Wow, it's quite the process. I always think the biggest challenge with sustainability too is how do you do it in a way that's at least as effective as the alternative, right?
Yes.
Everyone. It seems like everyone loves this concept of doing better until they look at the price, and if it's more
Hmm.
expensive, then I don't want to deal with it.
That we have long felt that if you want to take over an industry, if you want to shift an industry, it has to be better, cheaper, greener. And we have targeted products and customers where we can have that value proposition to them, because there's a willingness to spend more in a strong economy. But the minute that the economy shifts, those nice to haves become exactly that. And we position our products as a way of saving businesses money. And I think that's really important because, um, you know, in tough times, we need to be able to figure out the systems where we can make that case. And that means that there's some products that just don't work right now. Um, in the future, that we expect that to shift, particularly as policy starts to kind of tax some of the more harmful materials, as well as just like scarcity starts to make things more expensive. But we're focusing first on the products where there's an economic case. And with a lot of products, it really is cheaper to wash something than thinking about everything that goes into creating it and shipping it here.
Hmm.
And what you need though is scale. So you need mass quantities, because you don't get those efficiencies at low volumes. And so you need to make sure that you are getting high volumes of things. And when you get high volumes of things, it's actually like the economic case for reuse is pretty strong. With the exception of thin film plastics, that like when we talk to a business and they're using plastic baggies that cost 4 cents. It's like, you can't, like, we can't get there. That's where probably there needs to be some policy
Yeah.
to push people in a
Well, I
direction.
think like reuse, use recyclable bags, or just, we always keep bags in the car. I think a
Yeah.
lot of things around sustainability are, how do you, one, that's a lot of what my hope is with this channel, is how do you enlighten people so they even know? And that was kind of the
Yeah.
mission that I started with, was what is my impact to the planet? And then one of the things I discovered since we chatted last was the average American produces 128,000 pounds of trash in a lifetime, which I was like, okay, whoa, okay. And then you got to unpack that and go, okay, well, now that I understand that, well, what are all the different things you can do? And so one is having that like a grocery bag. Well, duh. Usually I go down to the market, and part of it's a forcing function. I just know whatever I can carry out is what I'm going to buy, so I don't have to, in case I forget my bag. And that's,
Yep.
or I have it in the car. The other one my family started doing a lot lately was these hydro flasks, because we just bring our bottles everywhere. And
Right.
the hard part was getting us to all really embrace this, because it's about convenience. But now we treat these water bottles like putting on shoes. So they're all by
Right.
the house, and we take them everywhere we go. We travel, and we take them, with us. And part of that was just, again, enlightenment and the kids understanding that, there's over 500 billion bottles created every single year, plastic water bottles. And you
It's
see them back,
insane.
like you said, in the ocean. You were a surfer. I was just down in Puerto Vallarta. They were plastic everywhere. Eventually, it became a game. Like, oh, there's another water bottle, and it was just all floating around out in the ocean.
Yeah, and I think that was my aha moment, is that I had heard about, like in San Francisco, there's beach cleanups, and I just assumed that there was like a bunch of jerks littering our beaches. And then I
Just
moved to
throwing the
Hawaii.
bottles.
Yeah, like I'm like, people just need to clean up after themselves. Like, this is crazy. And then you go to Hawaii, and what I saw there was so eye-opening, because it was the most remote beaches that were the dirtiest, because people are cleaning up the most populated beaches, but we're cleaning up what's washing from the oceans.
That's right.
And when you go to the least populated, the least, traveled beaches, that's where there's not a cleanup crew constantly making the beaches look pretty. And I was like, oh no, this is so much worse than I thought.
That it's actually the rivers that's washing out. Somebody said this. I forgot who. I think a scientist, that our water, or think of the ocean as the womb of our planet. I was like, that's such a great way to think about it, right?
Yeah.
It's constantly in process of doing things for us. And rivers, rivers are always, sucking out water and draining water out into the ocean. That's where a lot of the plastics come out. It's actually not on the beaches. It's inland that just gets washed out.
That's exactly right. And I think that there was a study that showed like 9 or 10 rivers are responsible for the vast majority of the ocean plastics. And at first, because none of those rivers are in the US was like, see, like, it's not us.
Not our problem.
But
Everyone feels like it's not our problem, but it's everyone's problem.
well, and here's the reality, is that when you trace where we're sending our recycling to, or our sending our waste, because a lot of that is not happening in the US. It's those countries
Yeah.
that are picking through mountains of trash to try to recycle some things. There's no accountability, or there's very little accountability. And so the stuff that's entering these rivers often is American products and American
Yeah.
packaging, that we're shipping to pretend like we're going to recycle it, or to make it not our problem. And then it just enters back into the ocean, which of course then becomes our problem. And so we like to say, throwing away, there is no away. There's no away. Like,
Yeah.
we can't do it.
I was looking at this stat. I think I shared this in an earlier episode, that we've now doubled our population. We hit 8 billion people in November. And
So
so, okay,
crazy.
we 2x since I was born.
Yeah.
And I'm not that old. But we've 9x'd the amount of plastic.
Right.
And I think that's just the thing you think about. I mean, aluminum is really an interesting product, because you can keep reusing it again and again. Plastic, not really, right? Like, it's very, very little of it you can actually recycle.
So, yes, aluminum has a really high reclamation rate. I think in the US, something like 70-75% of aluminum is recycled, which is awesome. Plastics can only be downcycled, so they're not infinitely recyclable like aluminum. What I would say, there's a benefit of plastics, is that they are more reusable than aluminum, because aluminum, you start to get concerns about, like, like the aluminum leaching. Plastics, for some plastics, that's true. There are more inert plastics that are reusable, and that's been, I entered this with like, I hate plastics, and I would say that I still like glass and other materials better. But plastics from a carbon standpoint, because of how lightweight it is for a product, if they're designed to be used more than once, like they actually can be reused often many times. It's just that the plastics industry marketed them as single use
Hmm.
because you can sell more, when in fact, and because of how cheap they were, they could be used as single use. Recycling was really kind of like a marketing campaign. And in fact, plastics in a lot of situations, just like with those gel packs, are perfectly durable. And in fact, in like a not a bad material choice, as long as the products are reused. So yeah, I think that it's been really interesting to kind of like unpack how different materials, the circular how circularity should look probably varies. And aluminum's one where both the carbon, the economics, and the fact that there's high participation in recycling. Aluminum works great from a recycling standpoint.
As a kid, I remember going to it was because I got to keep all the money. So I would go break all the cans down and take it to the
Totally.
aluminum place. And
Yeah.
I remember doing that all the time. I don't really
Yep.
know if we do that much anymore, but because now we have, back when I was a kid, I think we just threw everything in the trash. I don't think we really, at least here in Seattle, we have 3 different bins. We have the recycle bin, compost bin, and a trash bin now.
Yep. Yeah, and there's still aluminum recycling centers, which I don't know if you guys have these in Seattle, but like we have pickers that come through and get all the cans out of your recycling bin and go sell them,
Yep.
because there's a value there. And I think that um, what you're talking, something that you said earlier sparked my mind, which was buying recycled plastic products, like the recycled trash bags or something. And that's the problem with plastics, is that recycled plastics cost more than virgin plastics. So if that's the case, how do you make it so that there is a secondary market for recycled plastics? That's one place that a consumer can influence, is if we're buying the recycled products and there's more of a demand for recycled plastic stuff made out of recycled versus virgin plastics. Now, the stuff that is recyclable, you're starting to create that secondary market, because part of the challenge is, even if plastics are recyclable, if that recycled product's more expensive,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter if you recycle it if no one's going to buy it, and then recyclers won't recycle it. So we can kind of put our, tip the scales a little bit there.
Yeah, I think to really solve this massive problem, like I said earlier, this is kind of our problem and not our problem. Like everyone's pointing the fingers, like who's accountable for this? So it's like we're all in it, and I think
Yeah.
it requires government, it requires business, and it requires us as consumers. It takes all 3 to really, I think, drive a lot of change. But again, I think
Yes.
part of it is just being aware. Okay, great. Once you're aware, then you can think of kind of the actions. But I do think like government needs to play more of a role. And you see some of this. I think the challenge, of course, is just the life cycles of government being so short. Like this is a problem
Yes.
you need to think on decades to really
Yes.
solve at that level. And my hope is you get enough people talking about it and educated on it that they create some pressure. So the
Yep.
government really puts dollars behind it. And I don't know if you remember Carl Sagan back in like when I was a kid. He was the guy that was talking about, because we finally started to get data like, 20, 30 years ago about global warming.
Hmm.
And I think part of it was, I think it was like in the 60s, I think we launched the shuttle, and we landed on the moon. And then we had all these satellites out there, and we got more data, and we started looking at these things and looking at global warming. And he has this really interesting clip that I found online where he's talking about, he's talking to, I forgot, a bunch of different folks in government about the cost of the Cold War. And he talks about, we spent $10 trillion on a war over a period of time that might have happened,
Right.
and never really did. And his point is, look, global warming is happening, and
Yeah.
we're spending like maybe a few $1 billion on it. And I think it's going to require investment in the level of trillions to really do this well. But I think they have to start doing this, and I think it's going to create a lot of jobs. I think there's a lot of value creation
Oh,
that
100%.
comes out of this. But so far I've just seen these small incremental things that people are doing. And when you look at the scale of the problem, I think people feel good, like, oh, we're on track to do good things, or I recycle. It's like, yeah, a subset of it. We still haven't bent the curve, is my point, in terms of like
Oh, in
CO2
fact,
emissions.
in CO2 emissions, and then in recycling is down as of last year.
Yeah.
From like plastics recycling went from 9 down to 5%. So like we're actually moving in the opposite direction that we need to be moving. And I agree that the political cycle is problematic, because I think that, we point to some other countries as being part of the problem. And I think that the US is a problem, and there's some other large players that also need to get on track. But those countries that don't have, turnover every 4 years, they know that they're kicking themselves, like 10 to 20 years from now if they don't get ahead of this, or they'll be kicking themselves. And so like they are more incentivized, I think, to make that investment than the way that our political institution is set up. And that scares me about the US, is that we have no capability of doing projects that will help, that don't have immediate returns for our politicians. And I think that that's why a lot of these issues have been more localized, because I don't know if there's less political risk, or sometimes I don't know what all the term limits are on a local level. But in Hawaii, that's what we saw, is once you get the business community and then some grassroots energy, then the politicians feel like it's de-risked and they'll make bold steps.
Yeah.
And that's what really happened with the Ocean Friendly Restaurants program that we launched in Hawaii, is that we got the premium restaurants to switch to more sustainable practices, more sustainable packaging. There was enormous grassroots momentum on like the local Hawaiian level. And then policy that had stagnated for over a decade was finally de-risked enough that we were able to show a lot of restaurants are participating. They've switched. They haven't gone out of business. So that storyline that some businesses had been saying to stop any policy from passing was no longer, like, we were able to disprove that. And so I think that with dispatch, that's how we think about it. Let's prove that reuse works, at least in some segments.
Yep.
And I think it'll help de-risk the policy for the policymakers, because even like with some of the aggressive policy that California is passing around EVs, that wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been, innovation and adoption in the EV segment first. Like they couldn't have done it 10 years ago and say like, you have to get there. It just never would have happened.
Yeah. You got the consumers there, and I think that's a lot, again, what I'm trying to focus on here with this kind of content. Like, how do you make sure that the consumer understands? Because to attack this challenge, I believe it's all doable, but you have to hit it at every level. You have to hit it at every level. You have to look at like what you're doing with, logistics around, packaging. You have to think about energy efficiency, consumption, clothing, like all these distribution, like all of these things are complex systems, and you just got to look up and down. But I think like anything else, you got to get enough people talking. And I think what gives me a lot of excitement and optimism is where we are now versus even 5 years ago. I think you see the government's taking this a lot more serious, putting dollars behind it. You're seeing investments. Like there's a number of venture capital firms that they all have some type of sustainability fund now. Yep. And I think they were getting pressures from their LPs to say, hey, what are we doing here?
Totally.
And so I think there is more momentum. I just think we need more people talking about it and kind of pushing that rock up the hill.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, the reason why we're able to, I would say, attract the business partners that we have is that the customers were churning and citing packaging waste. That makes it.
I was one of those.
Yeah, exactly. That happens, and they pay attention because these businesses are capturing the data on why customers are leaving. Customer lifetime value is an important metric for them, and so they're incentivized to shift. And that is where we can be really powerful, I think, in influencing the way that, because then even if 25% of people are churning because of packaging waste, now they're going to roll out the program for the whole 100%. Yeah. So it's really a great way of having kind of like some very vocal people influence a business in a way. I remember when Newman's like pasta sauce switched from glass to plastic. And I immediately, because I like always would get that pasta sauce, I immediately emailed them and I was like, "Oh, I'm disappointed that you switched to plastic." And then they messaged me back and they're like, "There has been an overwhelming wave of complaints. We are switching back to glass," and they're back to glass.
Sweet.
So I was like, "Wow, it's really cool to see your voice be heard."
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a huge brand. So I mean, I'm curious, like, how big is this challenge when you think about the problem you're trying to solve?
So essentially, nearly a trillion disposable food packaging items are created every year. Um, and so the problem's enormous, and the vast majority, around 80%, are either landfilled, lost, or incinerated. So these are not composted or recycled. And we're dumping so much money into not solving this problem. Almost $2 trillion are spent on waste management globally to bury or burn these things. It's insane.
Yeah. Well, in your mind, if we moved, let's say you make a lot of progress, and clearly this will take time. If we started to move to be, where the majority of this is reuse, what do you think the impact would be?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the most exciting things about reuse is that there's a really strong carbon case. In fact, if the US shifted to a reuse model versus like a linear waste management model that we have now, it would be the carbon equivalent of removing 27% of US cars from the road. So this is a major lever that we can pull in curbing climate change. And I think conceptually, like one thing I like to touch on is we get asked like, well, what about the fact that you guys are driving trucks to pick things up and deliver them? The average route that our packaging travels is much more localized versus when you think about the supply chain of a product that is, grown or mined in one country. Often those materials are shipped to another country, then they're either flown or shipped to the US, and then they eventually make it to a business and then your house. That supply chain is so much longer, and there's so much more energy, water, and resources that go into making those products than to have localized processing centers. And that's where a lot of the carbon savings comes from, as well as the kind of methane emissions that happen when products are landfilled. So the carbon case for reuse is really strong, and it's pretty exciting to think about how we could use this as a tool in our toolkit to help curb carbon.
Yeah, that's staggering. I think the thing that I'm also excited about, because I do believe, I was telling my daughter, I said, you may not have a driver's license. Like, I'm very bullish on having autonomous vehicles because there's time I love driving, but there's times where I don't want to.
For sure.
So if you think about the fast forward this, where you've got really fully electric vehicles, self-driving cars, I just think, if you think of all this value, like again, back to when I started OfferUp, I just felt like value was stuck everywhere locally. It's
Yep.
still going there. Like it's growing in these urban areas, just filling up everywhere. And so I think you unlock that by, if you've got electronic, cars driving around with nobody in them, I think you'll get couches delivered from across town for less than $5. I think that's our future. It's exciting to me because I think it's going to really have a massive reduction in carbon. Back to your point, like we're a global economy now at this point. We get stuff all
Hmm.
over the place, and
Yep.
every step of that way in that supply chain produces carbon for the most part.
Yes. It's funny because some of our partners are like, tell us that we're lucky because we're never running empty trucks, which to us is just like, duh. But to them, they're packing in one area and transporting to another area, and then the trucks have to drive back empty.
Yeah,
And so, like, even the fact that we're essentially backhauling, that's value capture.
that's right.
That most companies that operate in a linear fashion are not. So I think that's similar to your couch example. Like we're plugging things in backhauling that a lot of companies wish that they could, capture that value somehow.
Well, thank you so much for your time. A question: if people want to know more about Dispatch Goods, or you want to get new customers, what's the best way? Do they simply go to your website?
Yeah, dispatchgoods.com. There's a way of messaging us. If there's businesses you think that we should be partnering with, feel free. Also, we're always hiring. So if you're interested in joining kind of this reuse movement, we're always looking for really passionate people. And none of us came from sustainability. We all just did things in different roles that now have translated because I like to say that we need salespeople, we need engineers. You don't have to be an engineer that previously worked in sustainability. So we're excited to talk to really smart and passionate people that want to solve this enormous issue.
Well, it's definitely a big one, and we're all in it together. So thank you so much, Lindsay. I really appreciate the time, and just wonderful to learn more about your company and just talk about this topic. So really, really thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is really fun.